Thank you, Tim. That was a beautiful story, wonderfully told. I'm going to tell a different story, and that is the history of the conservation of painted wood sculpture at the Cloisters. One of the glories of European medieval art is polychrome wood sculpture, carved figures that were decorated with paint, metal leaf, and other colorful materials. Mostly originating from church interiors, these sculptures were particularly effective aids in worship, often depicting biblical scenes or Christian saints and holy figures. Beyond the carving, the close imitation of skin, hair, garments, and attributes achieved through the painter's art amplified the emotional connections of the faithful to the images. When we look at medieval polychrome wood sculpture in a museum today, it is in a setting profoundly different from the original. Removed from its religious context and surrounding architecture, altarpiece or shrine, and often preserved in fragmentary condition, the sculpture serves a different purpose in its new institutional environment as a work of art. This transition from religious image to museum object is accompanied by a change in the care and presentation of the sculpture. While the history of collecting medieval polychrome wood sculptures in America has been largely studied, scant attention is paid to the history of examination and treatment of these objects. The Cloisters, a very specific collection of medieval art, represents an ideal case in analyzing the interdependency between the history of collecting these sculptures, their display, and the chronicle of their conservation. The Cloister sculpture collection starts with the opening of the Barnard Museum on Fort Washington Avenue in 1914, a story beautifully recounted by Tim Husband. Housed in a church-like structure, Barnard exhibited at least 16 wood polychrome sculptures, which he displayed as part of the fabric of the building and subordinated to the overall aesthetic effect of the interior. It seems Barnard did not pay much attention to the material aspect of individual works of art. With the dim lighting and objects displayed at varying heights, the aged and uneven surfaces of the sculptures no doubt even contributed to his aesthetic. Prior to their arrival in New York, some of Barnard's acquisitions passed through antique dealers in Europe, notably Georges Demotte, an art dealer in Paris specializing in the sale of medieval French art. Demotte is known to have employed a talented sculptor by the name of Émile Boutron, a man with the ability to, quote, repair, amend, alter, and invent anew, end of quote. Even though this sculpture was bought by the Cloisters at a later date, the example of the 14th century figure of a king is indicative of what would take place in the dealer's workshop. The figure was improved while in Demotte's shop in Paris before its acquisition by the museum in 1952, and on the right is how the sculpture looks today. It had been sequentially a figure of Saint Alexis holding attributes of a ladder and palm on the left, and a Saint Louis with a renewed polychromy and bejeweled neckline and chest and a new base in the center. Restoration at the time meant the return of the object to its full aesthetic and iconographic function, even if that function was a misinterpretation. Missing elements and architectural details were replaced, and lost attributes essential to the correct identification of saints were added, sometimes arbitrarily, thereby obscuring the meaning of the work. Once Barnard's collection was acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in 1925, a good deal of restoration was begun for reinstallation in the new building being constructed in Fort Tryon Park. Hired to reorganize the rather picturesque arrangements of the Barnard material, Joseph Breck, and upon Breck's untimely death, James Rorimer, carefully planned the installation of the collection in the new Cloisters. Rorimer avoided a concentration of objects in each gallery and strove instead to display individual sculptures to their fullest effect through advantageous viewing angles and effective lighting. Objects installed on individual pedestals or in isolation had to bear the scrutiny of close observation. Thus, along with a keen interest in the collecting of sculptures, Rorimer became extremely involved in their restoration. As early as 1929, a restorer and repairer of sculpture, Charles Langlais, had been hired by the museum to, quote, supervise the handling, removal, and installation of objects from the old Cloisters building to the new museum on Fort Washington. Until his death in 1966, Rorimer acquired over 80 medieval polychrome wood sculptures, and together with Langlais, he undertook the examination, cleaning, and restoration of most of them. Approach to conservation at the time was not well defined, yet Rorimer objected to both the concealment of sculptural form by thick overpaints and the indiscriminate scraping and chemical cleaning of sculptures then practiced in the trade, calling for a more archaeological approach to conservation. The nature of polychrome sculptures was particularly well suited to this approach, since over centuries, many sculptures suffered from repainting in order to make them more appealing or for reasons of changing tastes. A return to the original surface by removal of multiple layers of repainting approximated the uncovering of strata in an archaeological excavation. And so here you have what is called a stratigraphic analysis. And this is from an area in this sculpture that's in Belgium. And what you see here is the most modern paint layers. And what happens is that we work, and it's a very small area, these are centimeters. We work under a microscope and slowly, with a scalpel, just peel away the different layers and looking at the history of the paint to see how the sculpture was overpainted over the years. So this sculpture in particular, the mantle, was painted many different reds and many different blues, and this is the original blue layer. Between 1930 and 1950, Rorimer and Langlais removed obvious modern additions and overpaints on sculptures, and also retouched essential losses with subtle differences in surface treatment, alerting the visitor to the modern intervention. Under Rorimer's guidance, a shift tremendously important to the appreciation and conservation of medieval wood sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum had occurred. The sculptures no longer function solely as enhancements of a historical ambiance or iconographical type, but also as works of art to be valued on their own. The evolution in museum display that placed sculptures on pedestals for closer scrutiny was thus met by the development of conservation methodology that enhanced the aesthetic value of the individual object. The opening of the cloisters in 1938 was also a time which coincided with the development of conservation from a craft-oriented endeavor to a recognized profession. Gradually, museum repair shops evolved into well-equipped laboratories with scientific research capabilities and staff proficient in treating the collection. Scientific analysis applied to works of art was critical to three main concerns in museums. First, the authentication of works of art. Second, the study of materials and techniques as an aid to conservation and art historical research. And third, the analysis of deterioration processes and formulation of conservation treatments. Authentication clearly concerned American museums because of their rapid acquisitions of works of art. New scientific techniques, especially X-ray radiography, became indispensable tools in the examination of artworks for purchase. Starting in 1925, Alan Burroughs at the Fogg Art Museum used a portable unit for X-ray radiography, becoming one of the most important specialists in its application to authenticity studies. While Burroughs focused mainly on the examination of paintings, his analysis uncovered at the Cleveland Museum of Art a modern forgery by Alceo de Sena, a polychrome wood standing Virgin and Child previously attributed to Giovanni Pisano. At the cloisters, the figures from a crucifixion group were also X-rayed by Burroughs before removal of overpaints by James Rorimer and Charles Langlais. Rorimer actually notes that the X-ray had not informed him much on the condition of the original paint layers. And on the left here, you actually see the sculpture that has been half treated. With the upper half, the overpaints have been removed, and then the lower half, the overpaints are still there. And this is the X-ray radiography with the more radio-dense pigments showing up as wider areas, just like bones in an X-ray. Museum curators were also concerned about their ability to detect heavily restored works of art offered to them for sale. Rorimer investigated the value of ultraviolet light examination to the detection of past restoration and published the results of his research in a groundbreaking booklet published in 1931, and that is the ultraviolet rays and their use in the examination of works of art. And this is a recent acquisition that Peter Barnett will be introducing to you. But this is a picture, a photograph of the sculpture as taken under UV illumination. And what you see is an autofluorescence of all the lead pigments, and the sculpture is in excellent, beautifully preserved condition. So this is all original, but actually the areas that have been retouched and are modern interventions are those areas that are absorbing the UV light. And so all these darker areas are where the sculpture has been retouched. So there's actually very little restoration on this sculpture. Science also provided information on the materials and methods of artists, something increasingly valuable to curators. Of the tools available to technical study of polychrome sculptures, microscopic examination of paint samples prepared in cross-section is indubitably one of the most useful. Cross-sections were used as early as 1936 by the team Rorimer-Langlais. And this is a modern cross-section of a sculpture at the Cloisters, the so-called Lavaudieu corpus, a 12th century French sculpture. And it's a sample that was taken from this area of the loincloth, and a sample is as small as the head of a needle. And what we do is we embed the sample, and then we look at it under cross-section, under a very powerful microscope, up to 500 times its size. And you see here is the red layer. What you see on the sculpture now is the red layer, and before, in the original layer, was blue, which is a lapis blue and an indigo blue and the original white preparation. So it's a very useful technique. Finally, scientists and conservators were increasingly faced with the deterioration of painted wooden artworks and were asked to find ways to preserve them. Flaking paint was the primary concern, but the wooden support was also prone to damage by insects, fire, and humidity fluctuations. Paint layers fade, darken, or flake off. Metal leaf tarnishes, and color relationships within the work change. At the time, a very influential restorer based in New York City by the name of David Rosen made the treatment of flaking polychromy a focus of his research. David Rosen was born in Russia and had studied painting and sculpture in Paris before moving to the United States in 1913. And we see him here on a luxury liner with Matisse, because his studio in Paris was next to Matisse's, and he befriended him. And here he is in his restoration studio. Technical advisor to a number of museums on the East Coast, Rosen developed a technique called the Wax Impregnation Treatment in the early 1930s, which basically involved the immersion of the sculptures in a hot wax tank to consolidate wood weakened by biological deterioration. And you see a sculpture here being immersed. And on the right is actually the amount of wax that you needed to consolidate a sculpture, this particular sculpture, which is at the RISD Museum. And what they did was to weigh the sculpture before and after the treatment to see how successful the treatment had been. It transpires through his correspondence that Rorimer was keenly aware of the negative effects of wax treatments, with their significant darkening and dulling of colors and tacky surfaces. In 1955, with Langlais no longer employed, Rorimer hired the Metropolitan Museum owned a wax tank, used notably on some objects of the Egyptian collection, but apparently only one sculpture in the medieval department was treated by immersion in 1956, and this is the 16th century Death of the Virgin. And so we see here how the sculpture was severely infested by an insect-eating beasts. And so the sculpture was immersed in a wax tank, and you see this is a typical surface where all the wax has penetrated in these channels that were created by the insect. But we have very few of these sculptures in the collection. Actually, just one was found to have been treated in this way. In 1955, with Langlais no longer employed, Rorimer hired Moimir Frenta as restorer for the cloisters. This was a time, especially in Europe, when the study and thorough examination of polychrome wood sculpture became more of an established field of conservation. Careful observations led to startling discoveries of original decoration hidden under later layers of paint that, when revealed through mechanical cleaning with scalpels under high magnification, helped rewrite the history of medieval art. Frenta, who had been trained in Paris, became a highly regarded expert in the techniques of medieval polychromy, further promoting the cloisters as a center for technical studies. In 1963, his thorough examination skills permitted the groundbreaking discovery of brocade relief ornaments composed of wax or wax resin mixtures on sculptures at the cloisters. And this was truly groundbreaking at the time. And this is what a wax relief decoration is. This is a close-up of the robe of Saint Barbara. And these are relief decorations that were meant to imitate brocade textiles. Towards the last quarter of the 20th century, most museum activities, including conservation, were deeply influenced by the broader concerns of museum economics and politics. As museums attracted larger crowds, many institutions embarked on grand building campaigns as well as fundraising efforts. At the cloisters, Florence Deutschler, hired in 1968, had the original stucco walls covered in white paint, bringing the spaces more in line with modernist taste. And see the white stucco walls here. In 1971, Deutschler appointed a German conservator, Rudolph Meyer, who treated most of the important polychrome sculpture in the cloisters until 1987. Meyer proved to have a strong sympathy for the cultural function of polychrome sculpture and modified his treatment protocols to recover some of the lost contrast in tone and color that had animated the figures when they were in their original ecclesiastic settings. As you see in these treatment photographs, he used illusionistic retouching, varnishes, and wax finishes to evoke the glossy or matte appearance of aged paint. So these are all photo treatments before and after treatment. You see how the collar was, there was a paint removal done, and also in the hair. But what is particularly, what you can notice particularly is the varnish that has been applied on certain areas, and other areas have been left matte. The varnish is particularly noticeable on the faces as well. This approach may reflect Meyer's knowledge of and experience with church decoration in Germany, where valued devotional sculptures were traditionally refurbished. Meyer worked with great skill and integrity, but encountered, as all conservators do, the essential dilemma in conservation between historical veracity, the value of authenticity we place on signs of age, and the aesthetical potential of the work. By treating sculptures with modern materials to approximate their lost medieval appearance, Meyer could make only an interpretive reconstruction of a lost original surface. In more recent decades, medieval art historians have reconsidered the original viewing conditions of the sculptures, and more scrutiny has been paid to the role of the surrounding space and lighting. Recent reinstallations at the cloisters suggest the original height at which sculptures were installed in the church, by placing some of them high on the wall at some distance from the viewer. In many cases, the correct proportion of the figures, as conceived by the sculptors of the works, is actually better perceived from this lower vantage point. The stark white walls, which museum staff felt had a deadening effect on sculptures, were changed during recent renovations to warmer tones of plaster, approximating the museum's original design. Concurrently, conservators have become more sensitive to the viewing conditions of medieval polychrome sculptures and have acquired a sense of prudence in the face of the work's complexity. The issue of loss compensation is arguably one of the most difficult problems to address in conservation. Its resolution lies somewhere in between intellectual pursuit and manual dexterity, and often involves the more intangible notions of intuition and sensibility. The conservation treatment of the monumental Spanish Romanesque crucifix by Michel David-Weill, conservator at the Cloisters in the 1990s, presented an opportunity for reassessment of this important devotional image. The many paint losses on the surface of Christ's body imposed a dark, two-dimensional pattern of exposed wood, visually obscuring the subtle carving of the three-dimensional form beneath. It was clear that some restoration was desirable, but how much? The question of which sections to fill and which to leave alone was decided by an informed discussion with curators. On the one hand, the vertical fracture in the wood at the center of the body was left unfilled so as to avoid affecting the distinctive slenderness of the sculpture's upper torso. On the other, the dark losses on the torso were retouched so as to provide legibility to the sculpture's volume. Finally, a common difficulty for the treatment or even visual interaction with polychrome sculpture is the fact that many have lost all or most traces of polychromy. The paint and gilding layers have often been stripped at some previous time for reasons ranging from antipathy towards color to a mistaken belief that the carving conveyed the true essence of the work. For collectors, stained, varnished, or waxed wood was often a more desirable finish than uneven surfaces with flaking paint layers. One of the challenges of conservators today is to convey how a sculpture would have looked like originally, judging from the technical examination of traces of paint. While original paint uncovered during an investigation is a marvelous discovery, the strong colors of the medieval palette can appear garish to viewers in the present, and conservators' reconstructions of the original color schemes are often equally surprising, but hopefully inform viewers that many sculptures were once brightly painted. So this is a reconstruction of how the sculpture, a drawing of how the sculpture would have looked like the Montvianet's Madonna, which is an Auvergne 12th century Madonna. And so the mantle would have been this blue, or dark lapis lazuli blue, with these losange decorations in tin leaf. The mantle of Christ would have been this dark red with these little appliqué relief decorations that were made of tin and a yellow varnish. And his garment was green, and her robe was red, and there's this imitation marble or green marble or porphyry of some type, green porphyry. And then the columns would have been fluted by this alternation of green and red. This brief review of the reception and treatment of medieval polychrome wood sculpture at the Cloisters sets out to demonstrate the important connections in the 20th century between cultural and social history of these artworks, in particular their collection, exhibition, and publication, and their restoration and conservation. First acquired as decorative objects that helped create atmosphere in early museum installations, polychrome sculpture were appreciated in many instances for their narrative power, whether it was historically accurate or not, which led to the completion of missing elements. Approaches to conservation have diverged over time, either incorporating a scientific or quasi-archaeological method of investigation and treatment, or searching for historical continuity. Amidst this duality, the immaterial nature of polychrome sculpture, the mimetic qualities of highly illusionistic painting or intensely expressive features of the carving persists as the most important and intricate aspect to preserve. While we are too close to our own era to offer a critique, or even to fully understand how our actions fit within this historical continuum, it is evident that conservation is inseparable from the milieu in which it is practiced, and as such is an act of critical interpretation. A profound knowledge of polychrome sculptures is fundamental to performing any treatment, and that is best achieved by a constant dialogue between curators, conservators, and those who will be inspired, I hope, by these objects, you. Thank you.